And next in our lineup will be our fearless director, Professor Steve Schneck, who's the director of the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies at Catholic University, with his research in the field of political philosophy, but is also no stranger to these political issues we're discussing here today. Professor Schneck.
Thanks, Marianne. I know we're all tired. It's been a long day and we're running a little bit overtime, so I'm going to try to cut this out maybe 10 minutes or so shorter than I had originally planned. So if it seems like it's like there's a big gap missing, it's because there will be. I've been tasked this afternoon to pivot away from economics and toward the political side of the Catholic case against libertarianism. In truth, though, I will aim somewhat more broadly than that. Libertarianism, in my estimation, offers a comprehensive worldview that informs much more than politics and economics. It informs ethics and art, lifestyles, culture, and even relationships and psychologies. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it's as evident in a Nayrol woman's claim that it's my body, in the art of the selfie, in the doomsday prepper's fantasy of self-reliance, as it is in rancher Cliven Bundy's claim that common grazing land is my property. Imagine, for example, a mirror image of today's conference. Call it the libertarian case against Catholicism. Its focus would hardly be economics. Instead of Cardinal Rodriguez, such a reverse conference would surely have as its keynote address something like the long soliloquy Ayn Rand's hero John Galt offers in Atlas Shrugged, ridiculing mercy, ridiculing charity, ridiculing faith, ridiculing the poor as moochers, ridiculing those who would sacrifice the self for God or for others, praising selfishness as a virtue. Galt's speech in Atlas Shrugged perfectly elaborates the libertarian case against Catholicism. We Catholics believe in the primacy of the common good over self-interest. We believe so strongly in community that even salvation, we believe, is not private and solitary, but shared. We believe that on the final day we are judged not for our success, our own success, but for what we have done for others. Blessed are the merciful, we say. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Of course, in seizing on Ayn Rand and her extreme character, John Galt, libertarians will be quick to say, but Dr. Schneck, that's not fair. You're erecting a straw man, selecting the most radical of libertarian arguments. You don't really appreciate the elegance of libertarianism and libertarian solutions to problems of culture, ethics, lifestyle, and politics. You're missing the extraordinary practicality and efficiency of libertarianism in focusing only on the extremism of Ayn Rand. You don't understand libertarianism. So let me tell you a story. It goes that once upon a time, there was an unhappy, I love stories, there was an unhappy and dysfunctional beehive, a colony of bees ruled by a strict and moralistic bishop. Then the righteous bishop died. Sorry for the bishops in the room. When the righteous bishop died, without his moral rule, the bees were completely free to do as they pleased. Self-interest won out, of course. Exercising their new liberty, each bee indulged in private vices and selfish virtues. What each bee desired, though, was inevitably something limited in supply. So amidst the freedom of each bee pursuing private vice and selfish interests, competition emerged automatically in such a way that it modulated each bee's individual exercise of liberty. It was as if magically the competitive exercise of liberty erected a kind of a public discipline in the hive. In part, the competition forced each bee to think, even more narrowly, about what were her most important self-interests, and to work harder and to not stir things up by involving herself in the affairs of others. What had been a sad and failed beehive, when governed by the bishop, now buzzed, I love that, buzzed with dynamism and hummed with harmonious order. From the exercise of unfettered liberty and competition came a marvelously balanced and dynamic order that generated progress and efficiency, that automatically allocated the hive's talent and resources without the interference of authority, that even generated a kind of morality. Work hard and don't engage in behavior that would be counterproductive for your self-interest. From the pursuit of private interests in competition, in other words, at least according to this story, came a powerful order. From selfishness came a sort of morality. From private vice came public virtue. The bee colony hummed all automatically, with no laws, no government, no bishop, no church interfering rules or imposing moral norms. Now, I'm sure a few of you in this room probably recognize that my story is loosely based on Bernard de Mandeville's 1704 poem, Fable of the Bees. Here's a snippet from the poem itself, and I can't do this with an English accent. I really probably need to. Thus, every part was full of vice, yet the whole mass a paradise. Their crimes conspired to make them great, and virtue, who from politics had learned 1,000 cunning tricks, was by their happy influence made friends with vice, and ever since, the worst of all the multitude did something for the common good. Mandeville's poem goes on to trace the collapse of the colony when religion is again brought back. With an external religious morality again present, interfering with the bee's liberty and undermining competition by demanding mercy and love, all the marvels that had come via the unfettered pursuit of self-interest disappeared. With religion back, the hive no longer buzzed, no longer hummed with progress, no longer had a dynamic order. Repression, dysfunction, misallocation of talent and resources, and dreary unhappiness reigned. Okay, so I've given libertarianism its due, I think, right? That's the libertarian premise. That's the promise that it holds out to us. Mandeville's 1704 poem is a marker for the beginning of libertarian ideas. So while I agree that its provenance probably stretches back into medieval nominalism or something like that, libertarianism is best understood as epitomizing the Enlightenment. It shares in the Enlightenment's anti-clericalism. It shares in the Enlightenment's suspicion of tradition and custom. It shares in the Enlightenment's humanistic values. Most importantly, it shares in the Enlightenment's confidence that there is a kind of automatic reason with a capital R, that can be relied upon for order in human life. While libertarianism is so focused on individual liberty that it is theoretically antithetical or agnostic about social order, when its defenders are forced to address social concerns, their premise is that, we're focusing on individual liberty, but from the competition of our individual liberty will come an automatic order that will be the best for society. After Mandeville, on the continent, such ideas are evident among the French philosophes associated with the Revolution of 1789. For example, Jean-Baptiste Say, a laissez-faire revolutionary and Jacobin fellow traveler who advocated the disestablishment of the Catholic Church. Say's theories were translated by the German anarchist of radical egoism, Max Stirner, who in turn influenced the Austrian Karl Menger, who is the founder of the Austrian School of Economics that gave us Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. Stirner's influence on Ayn Rand is also, I think, somewhat evident. On the English-speaking side of things, the path to libertarianism runs through the Scottish Enlightenment, through the Manchesterism of the 1840s that notoriously opposed aid to Ireland during the potato famine for fear of fostering dependency, through the utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill, and through the social Darwinism of Herbert Spencer. Such thinking crossed the pond and found a surprising welcome in post-Civil War America, impacting national policies on immigration, on unions, child labor, race, environmental use, industrial safety, and much more. Gilded Age university apologists like William Graham Sumner influenced generations of American academics down to our own age, evident in people like Milton Friedman and Robert Nozick. However, in America, popular libertarianisms, leaning both right and left, have flourished, influenced by writers like Ayn Rand, whom we've mentioned, and Murray Rothbard. All of this is to say that I think that I do understand libertarianism, its roots and its branches. And the central features of libertarianism today, as evidenced so well, actually, in John Galt's speech in Atlas Shrugged, have not changed significantly from the ideas espoused by Mandeville in his 1704 poem. They are a negative conception of liberty, egoism, literally verging on solipsism in some cases, association of authority with repression and regression, antinomianism, suspicion of community and common good, absolute conception of private property, valorization of competition, suspicion of custom and tradition, automatic order or invisible hands, anti-institutionalism, suspicion of hierarchical morality, and obviously a negative conception of government and a distrust of government actions. Each of these elements of libertarianism is at odds with traditional Catholic moral and social doctrine, in varying degrees, admittedly. They are at odds with recent papal writings, such as Pope Francis' wonderful Evangelii Gaudium that the Cardinal just spoke about so eloquently, with Pope Benedict XVI's Caritas in Veritate, with St. John Paul II's Solicitudo Rei Socialis, and a variety of other encyclicals as well. But that's just recently. They are also at odds with the Thomistic theology and philosophy that has been foundational for the Catholic Church's intellectual tradition since the Middle Ages. They are impossible to fully reconcile with the Catholic understanding of the person, as we've heard over and over again today, with a Catholic understanding of natural law, with a Catholic conception of overcoming the self, with the idea of the mystical body of Christ, with the idea of the communion of saints, and so much more. Arguably, the Church's doctrinal teachings offer the bases for a sweeping criticism of libertarianism in its economic, political, and cultural forms. To frame the Church's argument, and I know this seems like a lot of ideas coming pretty quickly, I apologize for that, but to frame the Church's arguments, let me briefly sketch some criticisms of libertarianism from the political left and the political right, since my job is to talk about the political aspect of all of this. So here's a conservative criticism of libertarianism coming from the right, and this would be associated, for example, with conservatives like Russell Kirk or Robert Nisbet. Conservatives argue that libertarianism's competitive process and invisible hands do not yield order. Conservatives like Kirk say it yields instead chaos and social decay. It undercuts transcendent claims for what is right or what is good or what is moral, because the market, whether a market of ideas or a market of values or a market of goods and services, the market does not defer to anything beyond its own measure of what sells. And what sells are usually the lowest common denominator values of the consumer. Lower civilizational values like utility, in other words, win out over higher values, the sublime, the beautiful, the sacred. The values that have been raised up by long tradition, in other words, then, are no more valued in this process than the most immediate desires of consumers in the marketplace. Moreover, in overemphasizing the individual, libertarianism militates against fundamentally important social structures. Again, as we've heard several times earlier today, militates against the idea of community, against religion, and even against family, leaving human beings, therefore, isolated and unprotected from the pressures of mass society. In emphasizing competition and struggle, it generates mores that are at odds with social stability, with the result that all foundations seem as if they are continually being eroded in this unceasing process of change generated by market-like processes. Nothing is sacred, everything is in flux. That's a pretty good crystallization of a number of conservative criticisms of libertarian thinking. Now let me turn to the left, and I'm going to go to the far left so that I kind of give myself a nice space in the middle to occupy later. All right, so the left criticism, and here I have in mind criticisms from leftist thinkers like Herbert Marcuse. You might remember, those of us who are old enough to remember the 60s, that folks would march around with signs that had 4 M's on them. You know, it was Marx, Mao, and Marcuse. So this is Herbert Marcuse. And also more recently, Michel Foucault, a French post-structuralist, has made these kinds of arguments. From the left, the basic criticism against libertarianism, libertarians claim that market-like competition yields progress. They reject that idea. No, instead of creating progressive change, market forces reward the status quo. The churning and froth of market competition is judged to be just a sideshow of fake fairness, because markets are always going to reward existing power structures and their values. Leftists would also say, nor are markets and market outcomes ever really fair. They are skewed by existing power structures. Understood in this way, libertarianism then would be at odds with genuine liberty, as for example Marcuse contends. Its invisible hands create really powerful social, cultural, and economic forces that actually repress social change and do so more effectively, perhaps, than other forms of repression. Over time, too, the operation of market forces consolidates power in fewer and fewer hands, thereby, and I think we've heard Piketty mentioned a few times today, he makes a similar argument along these lines, thereby creating, over time, greater and greater inequalities. Like the conservatives, these left critics also warn against libertarians' egoism, which, from their perspective, works against transformational social change by undercutting the opportunities for collective action, for class consciousness, and social mobilization. The participatory nature of the markets by these leftist critics is perceived to be just a mechanism for co-optation and control in support of the status quo. Okay, so there's a left criticism and a right criticism of libertarianism. Where do Catholics fall in this? Well, the Catholic criticisms of libertarianism, I would argue, share aspects of both the conservative and the left objections to libertarianism. With the conservatives, for example, Catholics worry very much about the corrosive effects of market-like systems on tradition, on community, on natural law and revelation. For example, we wonder, is the family just another possible lifestyle in the competitive market of lifestyles that libertarian approaches to culture propose? Is the value of human life for the elderly or the unborn something for market forces to decide? Can we allow the market to decide what society does about pornography or about religion itself? In other words, aren't we Catholics convinced that there are some truths that are so important that they really can't be relegated to the give and the take of the market? With the left, Catholic thinking worries that market-like processes really do co-opt and repress human dignity by imposing what sells to the masses, what most sells in society, upon everyone else through its powerful invisible hands. By virtue of its basic operation, market competition works against policies and values that are countercultural. Let me repeat that. That's an important point, I think. By virtue of its basic operation, market competition works against things that are countercultural. In so doing, it submarines prospects for real progress on important social issues of all sorts. Similarly, Catholics share with the left a concern that this aspect of market disenfranchises those in society who are marginal or who are otherwise unable to compete. With both conservatives and the left, recent popes have perceived that growing libertarian qualities of the growing libertarian qualities of the contemporary world are distorting foundational structures of human life in ways contrary to the Church's understanding of God's design for human nature and human life. But Church teachings are more thoroughgoing, I would argue, than either these conservative and leftist criticisms. Others today have spoken of the contrasts between Catholic understandings of the person, community, the poor, the common good, and much more. Given time constraints and my effort to chop out 10 minutes, I'm going to skip that part. I'll say ditto, I think, as Monsignor Stuart Swetland did this morning, ditto to that stuff. Instead, because of the press of time, let me just focus on 3 areas to illustrate the difference between Catholic understandings of fundamental political notions and libertarian libertarian understandings. And these 3 are law, rights, and government. So first about law. This is the libertarian understanding of law. Libertarians conceive law primarily as a negative constraint on liberty. Law, in other words, is always viewed as something that limits freedom. As such, law always interferes with the free exercise of liberty needed for the magic of competition to work. Hence, law might be, while it might be necessary for practical purposes, in theory, libertarians need to look at law suspiciously, and they contend that the less law, the better. In contrast, Catholic teaching presents law ideally as a positive formation of liberty. Law should inculcate value, which is foundational for liberty. It should direct us toward an end of perfectly completed freedom and salvation. Human law ideally reflects natural law, moreover. And natural law itself reflects the perfection of order and freedom in the divine mind. Catholic teachings then utterly would disagree with James Madison's sentiment in Federalist 10 that if men were angels, no law would be necessary. An understanding, by the way, which is very much in accordance with libertarian thinking. For Catholics, law is not at heart a practical necessity because of men's fallen nature, and women's too. Instead, it is a natural formative structure of divine goodness for human life. What I say about law here will come back in spades when I talk about government. Let me, though, turn to the concept of rights. And again, because of the press of time, let me just focus on one example of the Catholic understanding of rights and use that as an illustration of the way in which Catholics would approach the question of rights generally. I'll take the right to property, which I think is in some ways very critical for all of our discussions today. For Catholics, the starting point for understanding property is to realize that all legitimate property is ultimately something that we have been entrusted to hold by God. We can never really earn it. It has been given to us. Our labor, our skills, our talents, our social situations, these may all have been part of the process by which we have come to have property. But of course, all of those things themselves are gifts from God. So property is essentially a gift that we have been given to hold in trust for God. So it's something that we hold in stewardship. We hold it for God's plan, for the common good, and for the needs of others, and for our own needs as part of our relationship with others. We never really deserve it. Since Rerum Novarum in 1891, Catholic teachings speak of property as a right. But as Pope Leo pointed out in that encyclical, it is a right that flows from the needs of others and the common good. Property, he said, was essential for family life. It's essential for the right operation of community and the social order. But it is never ours to do with as we please. We certainly cannot allow property to be utterly determined by outside forces, like the market or the state. We are obliged to use property for the good of others, for the common good, for human dignity, and for God's plan. Our individual needs might be part of this, but they are never primary. The right to property, then, unlike the way that libertarians conceive it, is not absolute, cannot be absolute. The right to property does not inhere in us as individuals. Its foundation lies in the needs of others, the common good, and divine plan. So then, as the example of property shows, for us Catholics, rights in general are not privileges that we hold privately or outside our responsibility to others and community. All rights are rooted, in fact, in those responsibilities that we have for others. Now, obviously, this is a very different way of thinking about these things than one would find in libertarian thought. Okay, my last example is government. In some ways, probably the most famous, given the conversations that have been going on in the United States in recent years. And here, it's what I have to say about government is going to parallel what I said about law. Just as Catholic teaching presents law as something ordained by God, law as natural, as inculcating virtue, law as something positive in the formation of humankind and salvation, so too is government understood in Catholic thought. By nature, human beings belong in political governance. Even in paradise, Thomas Aquinas argued, God created us such that there would be government. Government properly helps form human life toward the common good, such that each of us flourishes in the dignity that creation has designated for us. Of course, I won't deny this, the state can fail to live up to its proper nature. It can fail to serve the common good by serving interests or factions. It can inadequately serve the common good by insufficient governance. It can fail to inculcate virtue in citizens. And it can repress or deform human dignity by confusing its own interests with the common good. But governance itself is natural and good. The role for the state is a necessary one. Its responsibilities are not limited to protecting citizens and their rights. Its role, in fact, is properly a positive one of formation, one of developing and promoting citizens for the common good. As every recent pope has insisted in their encyclicals, then, government is tasked with assuring that the needs of all are met if such needs are not met otherwise, with special responsibility for the poor, for the oppressed, and those marginalized. Now, for libertarians, clearly, this ideal of Catholic governance would be a one that they would lampoon with phrases like the nanny state. Are these examples of Catholic understandings of as these understandings of Catholic politics indicate, the three that I've just mentioned, law, rights, and government, the distance between a Catholic conception of the political order and a libertarian one is enormous and really unbridgeable. Someone might ask, but cannot these non-infallible teachings of the Church about governance, about community, about law, about rights, about the common good, and so forth, cannot they be safely ignored? Cannot they be safely ignored, since they are not found directly in the words of Christ or are matters of intrinsic morality? Well, I'm not a bishop or a theologian, although there are plenty in the room at the moment. But it seems clear to me that the political ideas that I've just discussed are deeply integral with the Church's moral teachings, as well as with the whole of the social magisterium. One cannot pull out these threads from the seamless fabric of the Church's teachings without risking the unraveling of much of the whole. So accordingly, I conclude this afternoon that libertarian political thought is incompatible with a Catholic understanding of political life. Thanks, everybody.